Welcome to the debate. Tonight our focus is squarely on the Toronto Maple Leafs, but not for what's happening on the scoreboard really, but for the huge organizational questions being raised by the return of veteran enforcer Ryan Reeves. Tonight, December 11th, 2025, he skates against his former team for the first time since, well, what he publicly called a period of disrespect and organizational betrayal.
Yeah, this is absolutely more than just another game on the schedule. This is high-stakes human drama, intersecting with professional strategy. Reeves is coming back wearing the San Jose Sharks jersey, and he is clearly fueled by resentment over how his exit was handled.
I'm at a whole volatile mix. It forces us to ask the central question here. Did the Maple Leafs' treatment of Ryan Reeves amount to a systemic organizational failure, one that's rooted in cultural disrespect and a real deficiency in leadership? Or was the decision to part ways just a necessary, if poorly executed strategic roster move?
And I'm going to argue that while the execution, the way they did it, the lack of communication was, without a doubt, flawed and deeply regrettable, the underlying decision to strategically move on from a 38-year-old player was pragmatically defensible for a team in Toronto's position, trying to win a cup.
And I'll contend that you just can't separate the how from the why in this case. I'm going to argue that the organization's actions show a fundamental failure of leadership and culture. And the evidence for that is the genuinely disrespectful and frankly cowardly way a 15-year NHL veteran was just cast aside.
That's a powerful claim. Let's examine the business side of it first.
The evidence for a systemic failure here isn't abstract at all. It's painfully abundant, and it's rooted in a lack of courage. I mean, the material we have describes his exit as messy, disorganized, and ultimately disrespectful. For an organization that wants to be seen as elite, that is a catastrophic appraisal. And for a player like Reeves, a 15-year veteran, it just suggests a profound lapse in managerial competence. But the way they did it, that's the real indictment. Actively burying him in the AHL for most of the 2024-25 season.
And that AHL move was certainly bad optics.
It's so much more than optics. It was called the ultimate insult, a deliberate move to force him out quietly, without the bad press of a buyout or the awkwardness of a face-to-face meeting. They were just hoping he'd quietly retire. This method, this exile to the minors, it points directly to a complete lack of leadership courage from Brad Treliving and Brendan Shanahan. Reeves himself publicly called out the absence of honesty and some communication, and that quote is damning. It exposes a leadership failure at the highest levels, and it speaks to a culture problem, not just one isolated incident of bad manners.
But you're failing to account for the competitive necessity of it all.
I'm just not convinced by that, because there is this massive organizational cognitive dissonance happening. Toronto spent the whole offseason talking about needing more snot, more physicality, more edge. They bring in a coach like Craig Berube for exactly that reason. And yet, they let the embodiment of all of those qualities, the toughest guy in the room, walk out the door in the most corrosive and disrespectful way you can imagine. They alienated the exact cultural element they claim they're still looking for. That isn't a strategic misstep. It's a fundamental breakdown in management's vision, and it poisons the perception of this new culture before it even starts.
Okay, but I come at this from the cold, hard reality of the salary cap and the roster structure. And while everything you just said about the execution, the disrespect, the poor communication, the AHL exile is accurate and really regrettable, we have to separate the method of personnel management from the strategic goal. The core decision to move on from a 38-year-old enforcer, who you have to remember carries a $1.35 million cap hit, is simply a necessity of high-level roster building. Toronto is trying to evolve, trying to be a serious cup contender under Berube, and that means your bottom six players need to provide reliable two-way utility at the NHL level every single night.
And Reeves, in their mind, just didn't offer that consistent on-ice value anymore.
Exactly. Sending him to the AHL strongly suggests that the organization made an on-ice evaluation. His speed, his utility, they were limited. He was becoming a liability in key matchups. So the organization was focused on optimizing the roster for performance, not for sentimentality. Now, was the handling terrible? Absolutely. Management deserves all the heat they're getting for that. But the underlying goal of shedding an aging player whose main value is off ice or cultural, that was strategically justified for a team that has to maximize every penny and every roster spot for immediate wins.
But that lack of communication, that decision to just bury him, that's where the strategic argument falls apart for me. Why not a clean trade, even for a late pick, or just a respectful meeting?
And I acknowledge the failure in relations there. Reeves' quote about needing a little bit of honesty perfectly captures management's failure in that specific moment. But, incompetence in handling one difficult departure is not the same thing as a systemic organizational rot that infects the entire structure. It's a regrettable outcome of a tough business decision about a player who, let's be honest, probably had very little trade market value left. And his success now in San Jose, I think that's an anomaly. It's driven by their specific needs mentoring top prospects like Celebrini and Will Smith in a non-contending environment. That unique situation doesn't retroactively prove the Leafs' evaluation of his value on their roster was strategically wrong.
That's a very convenient way to separate the tactical decision from the cultural impact, but I'd argue those two are they're inextricably linked. That value is always transferable. Let's dive into what this whole mess says about the management team's competence. If we agree that culture starts with trust and respect and courage from the top, then the Leafs failed on the fundamental level. The lack of courage to just look a 15-year vet in the eye and be honest about his future, that shows a profound systemic flaw. The failure here sets a chilling precedent. If management, Treliving, and Shanahan treat a universally respected guy like Reeves with such calculated disrespect, what does that say about how they view all marginal players? It affects how every single guy in that room views their own job security. It could poison team chemistry faster than any tactical mistake on the ice. This isn't just operational incompetence. This is a failure of character that now defines the brand.
I respect the argument about precedent. I do. But I think you're extrapolating too far from one very messy, but still, contained incident. Every organization has operational failures. And right now, the organization is actively trying to implement a new identity under Berube, an identity that demands accountability. And while the method they used on Reeves was poor, sometimes achieving that necessary culture shift, moving from, past sentimentality to hard-nosed accountability, it requires sacrificing existing people, even when the optics are as terrible as they are tonight. If we're looking for systemic failure, we need to look at retaining core talent, cap management, scouting, areas where the Leafs have actually shown competence. Poor player relations in one difficult exit doesn't invalidate the entire structure.
But management's first responsibility is to the integrity of that team environment. When you choose to save face by quietly burying a player instead of being honest, you're showing that your internal culture values cowardice over transparency. That is the definition of leadership failure, and it directly undermines the tough, honest culture Berube is supposed to be building. If the new culture is built on a foundation of distrust, it's going to crack under playoff pressure.
I see that connection between trust and courage, but the operational realities demanded a tough call. Perhaps the front office was trying to avoid a precedent of just paying veterans to go away when they still had some contractual utility, however minor. Look, they made a difficult, financially driven choice, and they simply botched the delivery. That's poor management, yes, but it's not necessarily a systemic cultural rot that's going to destroy the franchise.
Okay, well, let's talk about the tangible value they lost, which they are now actively trying to recreate. The Leafs literally threw away the exact cultural ballast they claim they need. Reeves is providing that exact impact in San Jose right now. Their coach, Ryan Reeves, calls him a fifth coach in the room, highlighting his massive impact on setting professional standards for players like Celebrini and Smith. This goes way beyond scoring goals. This is mentorship, discipline, physical intimidation. Toronto's evaluation that he couldn't contribute that intangible value was profoundly short-sighted, and frankly, it was completely wrong. His ability to stabilize a room and set a professional tone is incredibly valuable, especially for a team that has sometimes struggled with mental fragility.
That's a compelling anecdote,
but we have to place that value within the context of competition. The value Reeves provides to a rebuilding, culture-setting team like San Jose, which is focused purely on long-term development, is fundamentally different from the value required by a cup-contending team like Toronto. The modern NHL enforcer role is, well, it's drastically diminished. Toronto needed those roster spots for players who could contribute consistently at the pace and skill level required to win against the league's best. And while he's an excellent mentor, his on-ice contributions were deemed insufficient to justify a roster spot over a younger, faster, or more versatile bottom six forward.
So you're saying management prioritized a marginal upgrade in skating speed over proven, established, and I would say irreplaceable leadership.
Leadership utility. The Leafs made a cold-blooded choice to prioritize players who could help them win 4 rounds in the playoffs. If you can't consistently execute the forecheck or keep up with the play, your leadership utility unfortunately diminishes when you're competing for a Stanley Cup. They had to prioritize the on-ice product over the specific cultural toughness Reeves represented. And that decision is defensible, even if the personal handling was a disaster. They are betting on Berube to instill that toughness through systems and structure, not just through one player's presence.
This is where that organizational failure moves from being an abstract business problem to an immediate physical liability on the ice. Reeves' public declaration that he's going to bury Auston Matthews and his specific mention of Max Domi as another target, it turns this from a personnel issue into a dangerous organizational problem. This level of personal vendetta, it proves the depth of the disrespect he felt, and now the Leafs management has forced their star players to physically answer for the front office's lack of courage. Matthews now has to play with his head up all night. That mental toll, that distraction of worrying where a motivated 15-year pro enforcer is, that directly impacts his ability to create offense. You're sacrificing your franchise player's focus just to save $1 million or avoid an awkward conversation.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the existence of a threat validates the claim of systemic failure. The targeting, while it's dramatically uncomfortable, and yes, it's high-stakes theater, is entirely predictable. It's part of the code of hockey when a motivated enforcer comes back to a team that scorned him. Yes, it's an inconvenience. Yes, it puts Max Domi in an impossible position. The team's current tough guy has to answer the bell for the front office's mess. But this drama doesn't change the strategic validity of moving an aging player. Management created an opponent, yes, but they didn't fundamentally compromise the long-term roster plan. The focus on Matthews reinforces the drama for tonight's game, but it's an operational consequence of a strategic decision, not proof that the strategy itself was wrong.
You're minimizing the psychological damage when your top stars are distracted by the fear of targeted physical aggression. That is an organizational drag. They created a situation where tonight, the opponent's entire strategy might just be distract Matthews. And that is a direct byproduct of management's unprofessionalism.
But the distraction is temporary. The strategic goal of optimizing the bottom six for speed and skill is permanent. Management has to accept short-term pain for long-term gain. Tonight is uncomfortable, no question, but it doesn't dictate the outcome of the season.
Tonight is a massive test for management's credibility. If Reeves has a big game, if he lands huge, clean hits, if he successfully gets under Toronto's skin and affects their play, it will raise serious questions about Treliving's decision-making all season long. The optics of letting a respected leader go so disrespectfully, only for him to seek violent vindication against your stars, it creates a powder keg that Shanahan and Treliving have to just sit there and watch from the press box. This incident absolutely damages their reputation with players across the league. How can you expect to attract top free agents, especially veterans who value professional courtesy, if they see how you discard a respected 15-year veteran on his way out? Reputational capital is priceless.
Management deals with negative optics all the time. It's the price of doing business in a pressure cooker like Toronto. Their focus has to stay locked on the long-term vision they're building with Coach Berube. The market for free agents is driven first and foremost by money and the chance to win, not solely by how one aging player was treated. If the team wins, if they achieve that physical identity they're targeting over the whole season, which is the entire point of hiring Berube, then the controversy over Reeves' exit, while painful now, will fade. Tonight's drama confirms they handled it poorly, which is embarrassing, but it doesn't validate the claim of systemic failure. It just validates that they made an unpopular move in a really bad way.
I disagree. That requires a huge leap of faith that the immediate damage to their reputation isn't already affecting their standing with their own team or with potential acquisitions. They lost a leader through mismanagement, and they created an active, motivated enemy. That is the definition of managerial malpractice.
I would counter that they made a necessary strategic move to shift the organization's focus and improve the roster, and they just used the least ethical method possible to do it. The poor execution is acknowledged, but the strategic necessity remains sound.
So to summarize my position, the evidence points to a massive two-layered error, and it was driven by a lack of courage at the time.